Celebrating the 80th anniversary of D-Day, I am revisiting Library and Archives Canada, where I worked as a summer student, CBC contract, and film conservator for over 30 years. During that time, I had the privilege of handling and inspecting some of the nation's most unique motion picture films from some of Canada's most celebrated film companies. When war was declared in 1939, many young film production professionals joined the Canadian war effort and made their way eventually to the Canadian Army Film and Photo Unit. Much of the footage that they shot during the war was edited into the Canadian Army newsreel.
The Canadian Army newsreel, celebrating its second anniversary of service, speeds up production to a weekly schedule. Sergeant cameramen of the Canadian Army Film Unit shoot the stories for its production. Soldiers, specially trained in the camera art, they travel with forward troops to be on the spot to record the action. The film is taken from the camera and bagged for shipping to England. Dope sheets are prepared giving full details of the story. The film bags go to the main press camp. From there, transport planes carry the undeveloped negative back to England.
For years, the men and women of the Canadian Army Film Unit worked and trained, ultimately moving towards the most single defining moment in human history.
This time it is the 6th of June, D-Day.
Having researched the men and women of the film unit for several years, I was surprised when I came across an entry in the LAC database under the William Galloway collection. Scrolling down, I saw with great surprise a description of the materials in the record. War Diary Notes of W.G. Grant, written while shooting motion picture film during the invasion of Normandy, 6th of June, 1944. Helping me sort this out and on hand to review Sergeant Bill Grant's War Diary entries is Richard Lockhead, former manager of the Film and Broadcasting section at Library and Archives Canada. Good. So we're here to see the War Diary notes written by Sergeant Grant on the field, on the beach, on D-Day.
Thanks for inviting me. I was really surprised to hear about these documents. Really looking forward to seeing them.
So they range from, it starts at roll 27, and it works its way 28, we got 29,
Right.
30, 31 in 2 pages, 4 shots, 5 shots, and with footage counts for each shot. 32, which continues. When using his 35mm IMO, this is what he would have written down as he took the shots and recorded each one with the footage count.
So really, tell me, what do we know about Sergeant Bill Grant?
William George Grant was born in Vancouver in 1919 and grew up in North Vancouver, where at an early age he became keenly interested in the art of photography. 2 years after the start of the war, Bill would join the Canadian Forces in 1941 and enlist with the Canadian Signal Corps. In 1943, Corporal Grant would attend the Pinewood Studios camera course, and by 1944, Sergeant Grant would be selected to join a special group formed to accompany the No. 3 Public Relations Group as D-Day dawned. The special section was made up of cine cameramen, Lieutenant Colin McDougall, Sergeants Bill Grant, Alan Grayston, Bud Roos, and still photographers Lieutenant Frank Duberville and Don Grant. All went in with the initial landing, and together they scooped the world by sending back the first pictures from any Allied source of the long-awaited invasion. So given what we know about Bill Grant, what connection can we make between Galloway, which was the IDC that these notes were held under, and the connection to the Army Film Unit?
Well, maybe my own personal recollections of Galloway might help a bit. First, I say, when I was a young archivist, I joined the archives. I first met William Galloway, and I was immediately impressed by his encyclopedic knowledge of all Canadian archival film. Not only that, William Galloway was a colorful character, not your typical archivist by any stretch, right? He came over from the National Film Board, where he's the head of the stock shot unit, real encyclopedic knowledge there, and then joined the National Archives. He had the dream job that everybody wanted. Imagine this, traveling the whole country and the United States in the station wagon, trying to hunt down and acquire old Canadian archival film and assorted material. He even had his station wagon specially equipped so it would be able to carry the flammable nitrate material and make sure it was secure and cool. But Galloway was truly a unique character. In fact, he had his own unique cataloging system for the films he acquired. So he was and this cataloging system sort of reflected his passions and his interests. One of his major interests was the Toronto Maple Leafs. He was a big Toronto Maple Leafs fan. How do we know? Well, if you looked at one of his cataloging cards, you might see this. There'd be an item on a political story, an item on maybe a nature story, an item on human interest, maybe something on a new invention. But at the top of the card, in big, bold letters, would be this entry: Leafs 4, Wings 3. So this was Bill. But I may say that in all his travels, when he worked for the National Film Board and when he worked at the National Archives, maybe he acquired something like this.
So if the Grant notes refer to the films that Grant shot on June 6th, then where would the material be today?
Yeah, I guess this is history. Let's go back a bit. So 1939, the Canadian government created the National Film Board, which then superseded the Canadian Motion Picture Bureau, which meant that the NFB inherited the complete archive of the Canadian Army Film Unit after the war. But it wasn't all that easy, because at the time the NFB were in John Street in Ottawa, and soon the facilities were not good enough for their nitrate film. So they moved it all to the Rockcliffe deserted air base near Ottawa. And there it sat for a little while until there was a lot of public housing around it, and they were saying, no, we'll have to move you again. And they moved them to a deserted Air Force base, I believe, in Pendleton. A few years later, they had to move again, and this time to Beaconsville, Quebec. Now one might think with all these moves, each time you moved, the facilities for nitrate would have got better. But no, this was not the case. In fact, the opposite. Preservation of film, and particularly even nitrate film, dangerous as it was not a concern or priority of the government budget authorities. And basically, all the requests they made for specialized construction buildings for the house this material were not met.
So this would have been around the same time as the National Film Board began their work on the Canada at War series, aired on TV in 1962.
Yeah, there's a reference here in an article. It might explain Galloway's involvement in the Canadian at War TV production, and maybe his connection to the Grant notes. Now I'm just going to read a bit from this article in the Canadian edition of Time magazine. Broadcast on CBC TV in 1962, the Canadian at War TV series, produced by the National Film Board, spans Canada's decade from 1936 to 1946. The article goes on later on to add this. Film researcher William Galloway settled into a long-ignored cache of war film stored in an abandoned hangar of a decaying Commonwealth air training field at Pendleton. So Galloway and 3 other researchers combed through an astonishing 3,000 miles of film shot by Canadian Armed Services cameramen and British and U.S. film units. Also in the trove was Canada's share, 2.5 million feet of captured German war footage. With the film, the researchers turned up notes by Army photographer Bill Grant. Wrote Grant at the time, "My camera got soaked on a small landing craft and 5 men blew up beside me. I hope the film is okay."
So that quote is actually pretty significant because on Bill Grant's Roll 28 notes, he does say, "My camera got soaked when a carrier and 5 men blew up beside me. I hope this film is okay." There's a connection to the Canada at War series, their research in that TV series, and so obviously they must have had the originals with the footage to be able to make that quote that's here right in front of us on these notes. It must be pointed out too, though, that the majority of the World War II footage was shot on nitrate-based motion picture film, which was highly flammable. It was very volatile. It was known to ignite on its own under poor conditions, as we heard from Pendleton and Beaconsfield. And even a sprinkler system would not have been as effective as water, humidity, and poor storage conditions would have been more of a threat over time. And I guess it was just a matter of time, but in 1967, a fire broke out in Beaconsfield, the NFB Film Board's vault in Quebec, and according to Galloway, who took photos, July 23rd, 1967, early Sunday morning, a fire of undetermined origin wiped out 65 years of Canadian motion picture history. The complete military library, including all captured German footage, as well as hundreds of priceless films, were destroyed. Well over 25 million feet went up in smoke. And here we have, right on the back, it shows that the photo was taken by Bill Galloway of the National Film Board staff. So going from the notes now, we can see that Bill Grant, with each roll, retraces his steps. Roll 27, he records his movements inland. Roll 28, with his landing on the beach. That's where he says, hope this film was okay when it got wet from an explosion of the carrier.
It's amazing the detail that he's able to write given the conditions being on the beach like that.
Absolutely. Roll 29, with shots of German prisoners, searched by English MPs. Roll 30, more infantry and tank landing. Roll 31, on the beach, moving towards the village of Bernier and into the village. Troops and civilians as they moved down the deserted streets into the path of the advancing Canadian troops. He even had two women in the village sign their names on his war diary
amazing?
that appeared in
Right
his
there,
footage.
it is, yeah.
And I think it was one of the ladies was serving wine to some of the troops as they were going through, and it's a real nice candid moment of the French girls as they welcomed the Canadian liberators.
Incredible footage.
He was following the main advance of the troops. With their special passes and access, they were able to be right up there with the front lines to capture all the action as it was happening. And then something made me do research outside of the archives, outside of Canada. I eventually was able to do a search in the Imperial War Museum. I remembered doing research on the history of film units, and there was a Sergeant Grant with the British Army film unit.
Two Sergeant Grants.
Two Sergeant Grants. There actually was a Lieutenant Grant and a Sergeant Grant in the Canadian film unit, but there was an additional Sergeant Grant, Ian Grant, with the British film unit. And with that research, I was able to find a roll 33 by Sergeant Grant W.G. So William George Grant, the handwriting, identical.
Yeah, that's the same, yeah.
And in it he describes the place is another section on the beach.
Yeah.
Further landings, D+1. They have this roll.
Imperial War Museum.
The Imperial War Museum has this roll, so we know further than what we had originally here in Canada. On D-Day, we now have him going D-Day plus 1 day. I want to introduce two more documents that I came across a while back. A lot's been made about the iconic landing day footage on D-Day.
Yep.
Hitting the beach and Canadian troops landing. When I first became aware of the film unit was when I met Sergeant Norm Quick, when I was actually doing my archival assistant program under your management, and you sent me on assignment to report to these deuterium nitrate at D&D. And the sergeant in charge gave me a little sticky note with, he said, you might want to talk to this guy who's a veteran of the film unit. And there was the information for Sergeant Norm Quick. And as I started to do research on him, he ended up giving me one of these documents that took a while to find at the archives, but he initialed his document with his name, and it was a top secret document from the No. 4 Public Relations Liaison letter, 21st Army Group. This was significant because it tells me that Norm Quick was also curious about the landing day footage. And marked down here in point number 4, through the American PRO, I have arranged for a gift of 15 fixed movie cameras. These can be placed on leading barges and tanks, etc., and do not require an operator. The film is salvaged at a later date, and there's just a chance we may get a few really worthwhile shots this way. And then I found the original, or a copy close to it, dated 24th of May, 44. And on the back, there's a notation by Bill Abel, 25th of May. So a day later, he writes, "Notation has already been made about these cameras, and we must ask that no mention is made of their use. They are safe property, and we will have to return them. The film is not ours." So this explains why this footage is so special, because it is separate from the landing day footage that Bill Grant shot. But because the Canadians scooped the Americans and British on all footage, these two rolls of film scooped the world, and one is credited to the film unit as a whole, and the other one is to Bill Grant. And I did find a report from one of the censors written by the film unit's own Lieutenant King White, and in it he's reviewing rolls 26, 27, 28, 29, and 30, and he gets a score of good, excellent. And in it he says, "First combat material received, shipped by air to New York for special edition Canadian and American reels. Scooped American and British cameramen by more than 48 hours. You are to be highly commended for your initiative and skill. All newsreels in the UK, US, and Canada using this material, and many mentioning Sergeant Grant's name. Film unit getting screen credit." So Grant's getting recognized for his footage,
Right.
and the military headquarters mentioning the landing day automatic cameras
Yeah.
were not to be mentioned. And so because the Canadians' footage
Right.
survived the war,
Right.
and the Americans, and I'm not sure what happened with the British, but that's probably why there was confusion as to why all the footage belonged to Sergeant Grant.
Mm.
But it must be noted that the landing barge was due to the fact that the Canadian Film Unit installed the cameras, and the Canadian Film Unit retrieved the cameras and got the film footage back to England.
Right.
That beat the world by 48 hours. But I have yet another discovery to share right here in Ottawa of a camera claimed to have been used in Korea and on D-Day.